Hello everyone and welcome back to Nagash, and in this video we are going to be kickstarting a Seraphon series talking about why play Seraphon. So I think that is a very important question to ask before we start the Seraphon series. And if you haven't seen one of my why play videos before, we're not going to go into any specific detailed rules or reviews of the rules of this army. We'll be talking about this army as an overall. So we'll talk about the strengths on the table, off the table in a sort of a summarised way to give you a nice idea by the end of the video if it's an army that you want to do, or if there's maybe another army you'd like to do instead. But we will go into in-depth rule reviews when we get into those specific videos later on in the series. But as just a starter, let's first find out if you want to do this army and if you're just excited at starting this army and the playstyle of the army, as I certainly am. Joining me in this video is going to be Monty, who's joined me for a few Seraphon videos in the past, including a previous Y play, and we'll be talking about in this video why the Seraphon army is just so really cool, and especially Monty, who's been doing it for a very long time. So Monty, I'll let you start by just giving a bit of an introduction about yourself in case people have watched the last video we did, and what made you get into this army? Why do you love this army?
Hello, yes, it's fab to be back. Lizards are, I think, my all-time favourite army for Age of Sigmar. I've played them all the way since Fantasy. I'm very loyal to them, and they're just a cool army, you know. It's lizards riding lizards and dinosaurs and magic, but also technology at the same time. There's so much going on with them. There's so many different ways to do a whole lizard army as well. There's so many aspects to it. It's such a diverse army, but just with some amazing story. For those of you that don't really know about what the story of Seraphon is, they were the oldest race from the world that was, and when the end times came, all of their cities turned out to be giant spaceships that the old ones, who were essentially the ones that created them, had given them that they didn't know were spaceships. So they all got into their cities that turned out to be spaceships, and they took off, hitched a ride on the back of a dragon, and ended up in the mortal realms. And they do lots of magic stuff, controlling the realm gates and the flow of things. And their main goal is to kind of just mess things over with chaos. Everything they can do to stop chaos.
Yeah, chaos is their primal enemy, isn't it? It's always been it in the old world that was.
Yeah.
Back in the Lustrian days, like you were talking about, and now in Age of Sigmar as much. And they've got, in this, obviously, perfect time to be doing this video, because obviously they've had quite a long-awaited release, haven't they? Lots of cool new models, lots of nice new sculpts. What better ways to do anything to burn these servants of chaos alive, to stab them, to bite them, to electrocute them with magic. Loads of ways to finish them off. I think now is a better time than ever. Would you agree with that, Monty?
Absolutely. I think this was definitely a point that came up in the last video. They used to have some really old models. They've got some really cool story, but they had old models. But now they have really cool new models. So there's no excuse not to play Seraphon. It's great. Yeah,
I think maybe, yeah, you're absolutely right. Because I think maybe the last video, there was a little bit of like, right, so I can't recommend the army enough because obviously I love the army. It was also my first army back in Fantasy. But back then when I was a young kid, I didn't play the game, far too complicated, but I love the models because, as Monty's pointed out, dinosaurs, and in doubt, dinosaurs riding dinosaurs with magic and all sorts of Aztec themes going on. Why don't you love it? But coming forward to where we did the last video, it's like I can't recommend it enough. Like I said, it was amazing, really good in the game as well, fantastic for painting, etc. But we are expecting a model refresh at some point, and that model refresh is here. So, like, there's no point waiting out any longer. If you have been, if you want updated Temple Guard models, Saurus Guard models, maybe you might be waiting forever, but I'm sure there's some ways to convert some up, or there's like some fantastic third-party 3D printed stuff you could get just to give them some better heads and all that sort of thing. But apart from that, I think pretty much everything got an update. Like some beautiful, like I'll just say now, my favourite models that came out are probably the new Croxigores.
New Croxigores are very nice.
Yeah, I've always loved them, but I've always been put off by. I've worked with like Finecast Resin before, and it's put me off quite a bit, to be honest. So if I can avoid it, I will, especially with a new kit coming out. It's amazing, and like I've got 2 army boxes myself. And I've got a few other things like Lord Croak, the Underworld's Warband that came out, the Warcry with the Chameleon Skinks that came out. Obviously, you need to get all this built and painted, really, apart from that one Underworld's Warband, but that's beside the point. So I'm more than happy to fucking just crack on with this and can't wait to get started with the Seraphon. So now that we've sort of done an introduction of the army, a bit of lore, all that sort of thing, let's get down into the nit and gritty, really, because we've already talked that it's a cool army, and we can say that for hours, but that's done. So the next thing to talk about is sort of saying about the strengths of this army. And how I used to talk about this, and when I did my last Why Play videos a while ago now, was I first wanted to cover the strengths of the army from a hobbying aspect off the table. And I think that, I'm sure you can talk lots about this as well, Monty, but this is an army that very much appeals off the table because it's an army that's just fantastic to paint, and now more than ever as well, with the amount of variety of contrast paints you've got now, you can get an army of Seraphon built and painted very easily. You don't have to cut the old the bit of plastic that was on the feet of the old Saurus guard. You don't have to cut that off anymore to put on round bases. It's even easier to build and put them together. And there's just so much variety in terms of paints, isn't there, Monty? I mean, you can literally just, if you wanted to, you could do the old sort of schemes as they've got the traditional schemes. You can do like the Starborn scheme, of all sort of like mystical and everything, from the stars. Some really nice concepts of that in the battle tome that came out for them. And then you could go on to Google searches and you could type in, lizard patterns or anything like that, or snakes, and the world's your oyster, really, on that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think... as you say, taking inspirations from some real life things, I specifically did for some of my frogs. For those of you that have got ripidactyls before, you end up with tons of little frogs that you use for some tokens. And I've taken lots of inspiration from just real frogs for that. But yeah, I think as you said there, they're a really good army for contrast. Contrast works really well for natural sort of flesh, things like that, because they're all scales and everything. It fits them so well, and you can have a really good looking army really quickly. And that also comes hand in hand with some slight changes. So for those of you that have watched the previous video, you might remember that 2nd edition Seraphon, you could quite easily have some very big units. You could use units of 30, 40 Saurus warriors and have them do so much in a game. They were so useful, and same for Skinks as well. But then you have to paint, 30, 40 Saurus Guard 2-3 times. It was a lot.
Repetitive.
Just a bit. But with the revamp for how Saurus work now, they've sort of cut down how many you need for 3rd edition. No longer will you need 30, 40, but they're 2 wounds now as well, which we'll look at a bit more later. But this just sort of brings Lizardmen in line with the design philosophy of 3rd edition a bit more. But because of that, you only have maybe 20 or 30 Saurus warriors to paint. Or you might be running an army with Raptidon chargers and Skinks for your army instead. And you're ending up with like 20 troops instead of 80, 100 troops. So they're really easy to paint. You don't have to paint too many anymore. And with the new models as well, they're really great models, so you can really spend your time doing lots of details on them. I've been working on some Saurus warriors recently, who I've done some light conversion to some of them, and I've just been able to go all out on making their skin look really nice, the gold look really rich. I've got some Agridons to work on afterwards as well, which are really cool too.
And I think, like, for those who watched our last video on Why Play, we've probably near enough copied the same point we just said about how it's a beautiful army to paint. You can do loads of schemes of it, etc. But like you've mentioned there, the model count isn't so high now. And like, if you still want a horde sort of Seraphon army, you can still do it, but you don't feel like you have to. And also, where you could use contrast in the past with the older models, contrast really lends itself to the newer models because they're just so much better sculpts, like you said, Monty. Just the detailing and the scales just lends itself a lot better for like the paints going into the recesses and everything. There's not as much feel where you might put I think we've all maybe use contrast on something that's a bit like flat-sided, which a little bit like the older models were, where they didn't have in-depth scales and all that sort of thing, and just wouldn't really get the same effect. So when you've got it with the new models, you just get so much more out of your paints. And obviously you don't have to do contrast, but it's just an army that really lends itself to it to quickly get it up on the table, especially if you don't need as many models anymore. And I think there's a really nice theme to the army in terms of how you want to base it, because of course you've got the traditional sort of jungle theme. That's the same thing I'm doing. I bought some fish tank, fake plants and all that sort of thing. I've put on some of the bases to give it that sort of jungle theme, a little bit something like it looks like it's out of Avatar, where it's like the jungle's alive and like really vibrant. But you could easily have it like, I don't know, you could have them in the desert, you could have them sort of on like almost like a moonscape sort of realm, because that really blends into the theme of the Starborn. There's just so
you
much.
You could even go for a spaceship basing theme.
But there you go. That's one I hadn't even had a concept of, but that would work beautifully well with the army, and it would just be so different. And I think, like what you said there, Monty, just really goes to lend itself a point that there's not really anything you could do that wouldn't fit the theme.
It's just so thematic.
Yes, it is, and because they are, I don't know. You could say that about anything. You could say. You could base anything this, you could do anything you wanted, but it might look weird if you had I don't know, humans with bases that are really chaotic and all that sort of thing. But with Seraphon, you could say that the Starborn have just launched into a chaotic realm out of the blue, that sort of thing. That's why they're in this sort of like really harsh environment. So yeah, you can really do anything you want with it, and it is a fantastic army and really, really beautiful. And yeah, so that's kind of the thing I'd say off the table. And also, just one last thing to mention on that, I think that it is quite a nice army for beginners as well, for people who are new to the hobby, because like I mentioned about a billion times, you can use contrast paints, etc. It's quite a forgiving army when it comes to painting it, compared to the complete other end of the scale, like Heat Knights of Slaanesh, or even some things just like Chaos in general, where there's all that gold trim, etc. The nice thing about Seraphon is it's all mainly like organic. I think, no, organic, is that the word? Probably using the wrong word here, aren't I? What's the word, Monty? It's all about a sort of like
biological.
Yeah, not organic. That's all about buying your fruit and veg, etc. But biological and stuff, rather than it being like armored plate, plates, all that sort of thing. It's all like skin, and just makes it a lot more forgiving to paint and stuff, I think. Especially when you come to the patterns you can do on these models. If I don't know, you're doing some sort of like red and black pattern, and like the red's gone over a little bit onto the black. Well, it's just its natural skin, so why wouldn't it look like that? So I think very forgiving for beginners on that one.
It's also quite easy to start collecting them as well. So they've recently shown off their Vanguard box, which isn't out at the time of recording. But their Vanguard box is 10 Saurus Warriors, 3 Croxigor, and Saurus Old Blood on Carnosaur. 3 awesome looking units. And on top of that, combine one of the Vanguard boxes with, for those of you that managed to get your hands on the Lizard Men Start Collecting box, with that box, combine the two, and you have an amazing start for a Lizard Men army.
Yeah, you really do. And I know there's also some of those army boxes still kicking around at this point in time, which they brought out with the release of the army, or about a month before, where you got the Slanny, you got is it Raptidons they're called? Those skin covering?
You got 10 Raptidons.
Yeah, and you got 10 Saurus Warriors. There's quite a few of those things knocking around what comes to the battle tome and everything as well. So lots of good ways to start the army at the moment, and in the future there'll just be even more ways as well. So fantastic opportunities for that. And doesn't really, in the schemes of things, Warhammer is an expensive hobby, but bear that in mind. Doesn't really cost that much compared to everything else. So now we've talked about everything you can do with the army off the table, and why I think that's so important to mention is because unless you're able to play games, multiple times a week, which I'm not, and a lot of people aren't able to do just because, life gets in the way, you're going to spend most of your time building and painting the army. So you want to make sure that bit's enjoyable. So that's a tick for that box as well. Fantastic. And then what would you say are the strengths of the army on the table? So there's all well and good, having so much fun building and painting the army, but if you're going to lose every single one of your games, you might still have fun, but I think not as fun as winning some of your games. But luckily, Seraphon have always generally been a pretty good army, and I think especially in this new battle tome, they have lots of tricks they can use, don't they, Monty?
Yeah, I mean, one strength, as with last edition, is that there's so many ways to build a Seraphon army. If you want to play around skinks, there's some really good skinks lists. If I recall, some of the lists using skinks have recently been topping a few tournaments. But at the same time, if you want to use Saurus Warriors, Croxigor, whatever, there's some strong ways to build those that can make them near immovable as well. So you really can get the models you like, and there's going to be good rules for them. As I said, they're winning tournaments with Slann and Croak, which have become very key in pretty much any list now. Whether you're running Coalesced or Starborn, you're going to want a Slann. Whereas last edition, you could run 3 Carnosaurs instead and do really well. This edition, you want a Slann. They're really going to bring some buffs, some really useful spells to some of the lists. And they've also really benefited from the new General's Handbook as well. So, for example, with the rework of how unit spacing goes, staying in coherency and all of that, now you can have 6 units not having to stay within coherency, or 6 models not having to stay within coherency of 2 models. So you can have one big straight line or a wall of Agridons, for example, which is 1, really good screening, and 2, if you get 6 Agridons into melee, they're going to do a lot of damage. They've really benefited from that side. Also from some of the spells too. So, for example, Hoarfrost is such a useful spell in Seraphon. Quite often, a few of their units, they're a bit lackluster in Rend, which they have their ways of balancing that out. They have quite a few ways of turning wounds into mortal wounds as well. But then with Hoarfrost as well, they can start to put some really good Rend on top of their attacks as well.
Fantastic, yeah. So it shows that, like we're saying with like Hoarfrost, was such an amazing spell on this, but I believe it casts on an 8, doesn't it?
Hoarfrost. Yes, it casts on an 8, but with Seraphon, you have some of the strongest casters, some of the strongest wizards in the game. If you've got Croak on the board and a skink somewhere, you can get that roundabouts out anywhere in your army. And you're also going to be very often +3 to your cast if you have Croak, sometimes +2 if it's just a normal Slann. But either way, that's pulling it down to a 5 or a 6 to go off on. And that's a lot easier.
Because I think we're going to do some more videos in the future, because nicely this General's Handbook is actually last year, which I think personally for me is a fantastic change, where you don't get to game all the time, etc. It just makes it easier to follow the more up-to-date rules. And because it's going to be in play for a long time, with Hoarfrost and everything, when I'm covering other armies and I go I'll mention that spell and I go, it's a really good spell, but you can't guarantee you get it off. With this army, obviously you can't guarantee it, but you will be unlucky if you can't get that off, or your enemy is going to have to use a lot of their primal dice to try and unbind or something. So you should have a much better chance trying to get it off in this army rather than another one. And like you said, one of their weaknesses is they don't have as much Rend in the world as some armies, but this can more than enough make up for it.
Yeah, if you're looking to do high damage, often you're looking for that high damage in the form of mortal wounds, which is, of course, very nice because it means that your enemy generally won't get a save against them. Even your standard troops can end up doing mortal wounds if you've got Skink Star Priest, giving them the buff from the Serpent Staff, which I'd strongly recommend in lots of armies, whether that's going on to Raptidon charges if you're playing around Skinks, or if it's going on to Agridons or Saurus Warriors or Croxigor for a coalesced army.
Exactly. So there's just lots of things you can do with that. And sort of when we go into the strengths of the army, it sort of also lends into, how does the army play? Is it a combat focused army? Is it a shooting army? Is it a fast army? Is it a sort of like slower but more defensive castle build sort of army? And I think, sure, you can give me a much better answer than this, Monty, but I think it can play most army roles particularly well, can't it? Which is the
Yeah, you might struggle a bit more in a shooty army, but there's certainly a way you could make one with a bunch of skinks with blowpipes, some hunters of Hun-Chi with blowpipes, with stegodons, with bastillodons. You could certainly build sort of a gun line per se, Seraphon army that way. You can build some really tricky sort of hitting like a hammer armies as well, even with skinks. If you have Raptidon chargers, maybe some hunters with them as well, which, if you don't know, Raptidon chargers get buffs from Raptidon hunters. Raptidon hunters get buffs from Raptidon chargers. So when you get them working in synergy, they can start to sort of really do some good damage together. But then if you wanted to go for Saurus as well, for example, Agrodons. Agrodons, 5 wounds each. They're pretty tough, good save sort of thing. But then if you're running them in a coalesced army, they're also -1 damage. So if there's something hitting them with 2 damage, it's going to completely nullify the point of them doing 2 damage, which is invaluable against some armies. Some armies, their whole shtick is that they do 2 damage with their weapons, and that makes that whole army just do 1 damage, and it makes the person dealing 2 damage feel kind of bad. Croxigors as well, they're really tough. They'll benefit from that sort of thing. And then if you throw in Saurus Warriors, they're a little weaker each, but they're still 2 wounds now, as I mentioned earlier, which makes them really tough to move, getting bonus things if they're holding objectives, I believe. And then if you're chucking on as well, you can chuck on a Feel No Pain from Astrolith Bearer, if that's near them. If there's 20 of them, the more of them you have to chew through. If they're doing mortal wounds back, and they've also got all of their bite attacks, they're scary.
Yeah, exactly. And I what I like is, obviously we've talked about the models already, but just how much cooler the new models look, and how much they look like they can put out that damage, which I think is really cool. And so now we're sort of talking about like an overall the sort of strengths of the army. What would you say are the weaknesses of this army? Like, if you wanted to, if you were building this army and you think you don't want to sort of leave yourself exposed, what are the biggest areas of concern you would have when it comes to potentially losing against someone else? Or if you were going to fight a Seraphon army, what are the weaknesses you would sort of like highlight to try and take the army apart and kill them?
I mean, if you're looking at rules, you're going to build into one of them. You can never have both. If you have Starborn, you're generally going to have a bit more of a fragile army that you can't really make full use of some of the other units that will flourish in Coalesced. Agrodons, Saurus Warriors, Croxigor. Croxigor a bit less because some of them get buffs from being Niskinks, but they're generally just not going to be as good in a Starborn army. So a Starborn army, you're going to play around your heroes a lot to do mortal wounds, which you can do. I think somebody calculated something like 40, 50 mortal wounds a turn.
Oh, really?
In a Starborn army. Yeah. It can get scary. It can get to really insane levels. But if you're playing against an army which can just pick off that hero, if you're playing all around Croak and you get a bad roll with Croak and he just dies turn 1, then you've got a whole army of units which aren't going to be super strong, and they might struggle to do the rest of the match for you. So if you're doing Starborn, you're basing a lot of your army on hero, which is you're playing against an army which can kill heroes very easily, or is very good at shrugging off spells or mortal wounds. That kind of nullifies a big chunk of your army. And then vice versa, in Coalesced, you're not really going to have as much shooting. So if you're playing against an army that can kill anything coming towards it in the shooting, having some buff dudes for melee isn't going to be helpful if you can't get into melee. Of course, both armies will have things for that. Also, now Coalesced has a separate lore of spells as well, which there's still some good spells in there. I think the Coalesced spells are generally a bit better. The Starborn spells are generally a bit better, but they'll still do what you need them to, just maybe not slightly as good.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. But you spent less of the army's focus on that, haven't you? So you've got to accept certain things. And that was, to be fair, you kind of already answered it. But that's the question I was going to ask you. It's just about summary of both of the different sub-allegiances, which obviously the Coalesced and the Starborn. And like you said, Starborn is more sort of magic hero focus, isn't it? And skink focus, whereas the Coalesced is more about your Saurus, isn't it?
Yeah, that's sort of the brief summary of how you want to focus list building for each of them. Of course, Starborn, as are their sort of standard Age of Sigmar Seraphon as they have been since first edition. So if you are new, what Starborn do is they get to summon more units as you game, and you earn summoning points that you get to spend on bringing more things into the game. So you can start, if you lose a unit of skinks, but then get to summon in a stronger unit, you can sort of sacrifice some of your chaff to let you get to some of the stronger stuff. Whereas Coalesced, it's just all about making Saurus and monsters stronger. They get extra, they get +1 to their bite rolls, so they're better at biting. And then they also have -1 damage, like all Saurus, which is very good. Just because it makes the whole army so durable.
It does. And I think, I know in the past the Coalesced has been good, but the Starborn have always been, pardon pun, but the stars of the show, really, the Seraphon book. And I think now, if you were looking, most people would probably still say that the Starborn are the best part of the army in terms of, on paper, for how much damage they can put out. Like you just listed there about how many mortal wounds they can do. But I think the Coalesced still do have, it's not as simple as the Starborn are they've got everything, and then the Coalesced, they've got the bad part of the book. I think Coalesced can still do a lot of damage and a lot on the table, can't they?
Yeah, I think unless you're going to really a top-end where you're facing like the best lists in Age of Sigmar, unless you're in that sort of scenario, you won't feel disadvantaged whatsoever playing Coalesced instead of Starborn.
Yeah, exactly. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, but most people who are playing the game are not always playing on those top tables. I think even if you are playing on those top tables, most games you have in the year are playing against your mates and stuff, etc. For most of the time with that one. And I think the beautiful thing is you could really build into one side of the Seraphon army, like Starborn or Coalesced, and then once you've had enough fun with that, you could easily just buy a few more things and swap over to the other side, couldn't you?
Yeah, you absolutely could. That does bring us on to sort of like one of the other weaknesses of Seraphon, which comes into the weaknesses off of the table. They've got a whole lovely new range of models, but of course that does come with a bit of a new model tax.
Yes.
Quite a few of their new kits are quite expensive. So you will feel the bite in your wallet if you're trying to expand, per se.
Agreed. Like I was saying earlier about the sort of like the box sets you can get at the moment are like, well, the Army box set and the Vanguard box set, like those are good, well priced, but as soon as you start buying like the individual boxes, which obviously you can't buy everything in a bundle box, you have to buy it individually, it can certainly add up, especially when you think about how many heroes or certain heroes you need in certain armies, especially Starborn. Each box of hero can be like £30 or something like that in the UK, and then before you know it, that's just your heroes in your army that's added up, and they're the cheap ones, they're the little ones. But I think that's, you can say about any new army, couldn't you? I think is a thing. There is definitely a price hike with Games Workshop, but there's always been one, isn't there? But it's just you feel it more now than ever with some of the models. But that's why, if you're smart, you can buy quite a lot of because half the army isn't new, which is like the old big dinos, etc. They still look fantastic, and you can, because I know I've been looking, you can buy them like online, Facebook Marketplace, eBay, etc. For not too badly priced, so you can sort of save yourself some money there, where you're gonna have to spend a bit more money on the newer stuff because there's not as much of it on the second hand market.
Yeah, that's very true.
It's a way to do it. Certainly that I've learned as well. And what I say, when you're looking at buying second-hand armies or like things are a bit cheaper online, even if you look and you don't see anything, just keep looking. And even in the space of about a week, at the start of the week, you're like, oh, there's nothing online for, a good price for me to be able to do it. By the end of the week, there's a good chance there will be. Like, there's things coming and going all the time, especially in the Warhammer marketplace online. Facebook Market place for Warhammer groups, can't recommend enough. And also eBay as well, found some good ones. So yeah, so again, there is a cost to it, but just be a bit smart of it. Don't, for example, if you really want to have a Bastillodon in your army, for example, but you're like, oh, the Ashlift bearer is, I can't remember how much it costs. Let's say, I'm going to say in the region of £25 to £30, probably something like that, isn't it? A new Ashlift bearer.
I think it might be a bit more, but 27.50, I think it might be.
Exactly, something like that. So if you're wanting to buy one of those new, don't go to Games Workshop and buy a brand new Bastillodon. Get that online for a bit cheaper. They'll just be a bit more like, give and take, clever with how you do it. And you can really say that about any new army, to be fair, but it's something that I've learned over the years. And of course, like, third-party retailers, you can always get for a bit cheaper as well. But what fantastic models they are. What I'd say is, even though they are a bit expensive, like when you buy them, you don't look at it and you're a bit disappointed. You are like really, really, really happy. Like that you can't be dinosaurs riding dinosaurs. That's the point I made at the start of the video, and it'll be the point how I end the video as well. But what would you say? Okay, so for a bit of fun, what would you say are your 3 favourite units in this army, Monty, currently where they are with the rules, or you can give me 3 of your favourite units / models that you just love the look of?
I think, God, favourite units.
This is a tough one, isn't it?
It really is. There's so many good ones.
I've given you 3. I'm giving you 3 in no certain order.
I'm going to have to do Kroak as one of them, just because Kroak is an amazing centerpiece model. It's going to have to be 2 of the other new kits as well. As much as I love Carnosaurs, I think the new kits are just so well done. The question is, do I go Agrodons or Kroxigor? So I think the new Saurus Warriors I'm also going to go with. It's really fun to build them. They've got quite a lot of customization as well.
Yeah,
a surprising amount, almost more than the old ones, which is shocking.
Yeah,
but they're a really good kit, the new Saurus Warriors. So Lord Kroak, the new Saurus Warriors, and let's go with the Kroxigors. It's got to be the Kroxigors. It's an amazing reimagination of the classic.
That's it. I think like where the what are the raps called? The Agrodon.
Riders.
Well, the Agrodon Riders, I think they're really, really cool as well. But like, I have to go Kroxigors as well, like you've done, because the Kroxigors have just got the classic twist to them, haven't they? Like, like the old boys. You got to back them really. Well, that's it. And I think, like, cause I'm sure I could probably, if we did a video on another army or something, I could probably ask you, what are your top 3 favourite units? And you could probably give me 3 very quick answers. So it goes to show when you're having to really try and find what are your favourite 3 with this army, because there's just so many love it. And I think you could even do a top 10 favourite, couldn't you? Especially where it's sort of like some of the older models that could have done with retirement, which they have done, like, Saurus Knights, etc. As though I appreciate that some people may have quite a lot of them in their collection, it's a bit sad, what do you do with them now? I think that it's just the way things going, aren't they? Like, if you can, I know they're not Agrodon Riders, but just compare the difference in models is huge, isn't it?
For those people that do have a bunch of old Saurus Knights, I've seen some people online sort of floating the idea of turning them into Raptidons, which is pretty cool, since they're sort of like the smaller With the new ones, they're the new skink cavalry,
Yeah,
but
I'd
you could
definitely
easily
back
do
that.
some cool conversions there. Speaking of skinks, aside from Saurus, the new chameleon skinks in the form of the Hunters of Huan Chi
Oh
look
yeah,
really good as well.
yeah, they're
So it's
amazing.
not just on the Saurus side with really cool new models.
No, exactly. And I think like I can't remember what they're called, but the little pterodactyls you get in there. I know they're not pterodons.
The Terra
The
Wings.
terror rings. They're just lovely on there. And I think those Warcry Underworld warbands are lovely just to buy. And even if you're thinking like, oh, I hear you saying that Seraphon are fun to paint, etc., but I don't really know if they're my cup of tea, but I want to give them a go. Buy the Underworld's warband or a Warcry one. And I particularly recommend the Underworld's, is it
Starborn Stalkers.
Starborn Stalkers, yeah, because I bought that. And it's the only thing I've got painted for myself on so far. But I can tell you, in that you get two skinks, one with a blowpipe, one with a shield and club. You get a skink priest. You get a like a skink champion with a spear. You also get a chameleon skink, and then you get a Saurus warrior. And I know they may technically have different titles and unit roles, but you could use them as certain heroes in your army after you've painted them. And in that small collection of models, it gives you a great idea of how you would paint the rest of the army. I know that's what I've used it for as like a tester, and really can't recommend it enough. So if you want to sort of dip your toes in, that's a great way to do it. There's also an ice cream van going past, so if you can hear that, that's what that is. Although it's making me very hungry. As you can tell, we are in the UK. Right, so yeah, so with that though, because I want to keep this video, I mean, I say this video is a short video, it's probably gone for a while, but they always do. So I want to keep it as a shorter one of mine though, because this is going to be the first of hopefully a series we're going to do. Like the next video is going to be about how do you start collecting the army, because if you've got to the end of this video and you're like, yep, I want to do this army, the next video about how do you start collecting it, and we'll try and get that out to you guys soon. And then like do like a more like long in-depth army series like I used to do would be absolutely fantastic. So we'd sort of like leave no stones unturned there, to go to more questions. But to sort of like end the video off, here's another question for you, Monty. Why would you play this army over another army? This is quite a personal question, but I think that's how it should be.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple of armies there, all of whom are really cool. But I think a couple of them, especially with Age of Sigmar, where the designers have sort of explored a few different design paths down the road as they make the different units and different sort of expansions for armies. I think Seraphon is one of the, from a design view, most cohesive armies out there. I would say Chaos Slaves to Darkness might be on a similar sort of level.
Yeah.
But you can mix and match any sorts of units from Seraphon in any sorts of colors, and when you put them all together, they're going to look like an army. And seeing them all together, they just have that unity in all of the models and that common design theme that I think has been nailed so well. And then you chuck that in with some really fun rules. Like, I know I've mentioned it a few times about Saurus getting a bite weapon. Just giving big dinosaurs that are just your normal dudes an extra bite weapon is really cool. They just get to bite people. Because why not?
I mean, we've all seen Jurassic Park, Jurassic World, isn't it? They're not killing people with clubs unless there's going to be a new sequel at some point in, 2033 or something. They are just biting and ripping people apart, aren't they? So why wouldn't the Seraphon do that? And if anything, they're, well, not all of them, but some of them are, bigger. Like, you look at a Saurus warrior, that's bigger than a Velociraptor from the Jurassic Park series, etc. So why would it not use its natural things? And I just love the idea of it's like a Saurus warrior that's like lost to the fury of battle, and it's just so frustrated with its club that's not doing what it wants, so it just starts biting people. I mean, there's a lovely little story from, I think it might have been the old Seraphon Battle Tome, like the first one, but I might be wrong thinking this. But I think they had a little battle with Legions of Nagash, and this is back in the day where you had those nice narrative sort of stories in your battle tome that then led into a battle plan. And there was a vampire that bit into a Saurus warrior and basically just got burnt by like celestial light because they were starborn. And then I think the Saurus warrior bit off the head of the vampire. So, you think you can bite me, I'll bite you much harder back, which you just can't beat. And I think it's one of those armies, like you said, you can just combine it so well. Even if you paint it differently, it still looks the same. Because, like I mentioned, how I painted that Underworld's Warband, I've got all basically completely different colours because it was me testing out different schemes. But you put them all next to each other, and especially if they're based the same, look completely coherent. Which is a hard thing to do, to be honest with you. So it's really, really nice to see that. And I think you're right. I think they've got the design on the Seraphon bang on, and they really carried through with the updated sculpts. It would have been nice seeing some Temple Guard, Saurus Guard, etc. But apart from that, they've done an absolutely fantastic job on that. And I forgot to mention what my favourite 3 units were. So I'm going to say that. I'm going to say Croxy Gauls. I'm going to say the Saurus Warriors, because I think just bread and butter, like you mentioned, Monty, such a good and important unit to have really nice models for. And then my third one is, I think, I want to say Agrodon Riders, because I think they are really, really cool. But you've already gone for that, so I'm going to pick a bit of a out there choice. But the is it the Spawn of? Probably going to say the word wrong.
The Spawn of Kotek.
Yeah, Spawn of Kotek. Yes. I think it's a really nice revival of the Salamander, because I know it is different to the previous Salamander, but it is quite traditional to the classic one where it had the spine on its back. I think is a really, really nice addition and something that I'd like to get at some point in the future. So with that sort of said, Monty, is there anything else you want to add to this army as like a summary of why would you play Seraphon?
I don't think there's much more to say. It's either an army of big dinosaurs going around biting people, or it's an army of tricky, lizards that cast spells and have ancient technology and magic. It's just really cool.
It's yeah, exactly. It's such a cool army. There's so many traditional themes to it. Dinosaurs, classic, but with a really good spin on it that they've managed to carry through. And so it's an amazing army to look at. So if you're thinking about this army and you like the look of Seraphon, you just want that final thing to push you over the edge, you got to remember that if you love the look of an army, collect that army, because that's what you're going to be building and painting the whole time, and that's going to be the biggest part of your hobby. And even if you play loads of games, you're going to be staring at your models walking across the board and you want them to look cooler than the enemy's army. And then if you're thinking like, okay, yeah, well, I really like it, but what are the rules like? Their rules are fantastic at the moment. And obviously dependent on, rule changes in the future, but you can't predict everything. But Seraphon have consistently been good for a very long time in Age of Sigmar, since Age of Sigmar began, I'm pretty sure. So they will always continue to probably be at least okay, if not fantastic and brilliant. So just get started with that army and join us for our army series we are going to do. And if you're still on the fence, we're going to be coming up with how to collect Seraphon army for you, knowing things that you want to sort of have auto include in your armies, good things to add, and good ways to buy it for a bit cheaper. So with that aside, I'm going to say thank you very much, Monty, for joining me in this video. First video I've done for a long time as well, so it's great to have someone with me in it. And taking your time to share your love for this fantastic dinosaur army.
Yeah, it's been great to be back, and thank you for having me, as always.
You're very welcome. It's nice to do an update on the last one, because that was very popular. And until next time, guys, if you've got any questions on Seraphon, put them down in the comments down below, and I'll try and answer that best I can. And if I can't, we'll answer in a future video for you. So until then, guys, I hope you keep well, stay safe, and remember until next time, that Nagash is all, and all is one in Nagash.